Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today from your desks, your cubbies, your tables, your couches, and other newly fabricated personal business centers as we continue to ride out the storm that's COVID-19. My name's Harry Barnett, and I am the Executive Vice President of Alira Health, responsible for managing our clinical group. I'm joined this morning by two delightful, capable, and knowledgeable colleagues who will be giving you their insights and opinions on our timely and interesting topic focused on the challenges associated with remote monitoring in the post-COVID-19 world. First, I'd like to introduce and welcome Chelsea Eckman. Chelsea is an Associate Director of Clinical Operations at Alira Health. Hi, Chelsea. It's nice to have you today.
Hi, Harry. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Second, we have Amy Thorndike. Amy is a lead clinical research associate here at Alira Health. Hi, Amy. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Harry. Nice to see you too. Thanks for having me.
The title of today's webinar is The Future of Clinical Trial Monitoring. Will remote or in-person monitoring rule post-COVID-19? For purposes of trying to make our webinar both informative and entertaining, we've chosen a point-counterpoint format whereby my two colleagues are going to advocate for their positions. On the one hand, remote monitoring is effective and will become a standard, or conversely, that there are significant drawbacks such that it won't be widely adopted. In the end, as with many other hotly debated topics, the truth will probably land somewhere in the middle. As an overview, we're going to begin today's webinar with a quick recap of Alira Health's reactions and responses to the monitoring challenges resulting from COVID-19, and then debate the effectiveness of our current efforts to monitor remotely. We'll learn briefly about the origins of remote monitoring, to be followed by a back and forth looking at the benefits and drawbacks of remote monitoring in general. We will conclude by asking our presenters to offer their view on whether remote monitoring will become the norm once we enter the post-COVID era, to be followed by a Q&A session. Speaking of Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions to us at any point during the presentation by use of the chat function, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as time allows following the presentation. In all, it should take us about 45 minutes. Let's begin with you, Chelsea. It wasn't too long ago that we were chugging along with our projects, and then boom, without much warning, we learned that hundreds of sites are closing their doors. To me, the situation looked dire. What were your thoughts, and what steps did we take to determine how to deal with this situation?
Sure. Thank you, Harry, for that introduction. I definitely had a similar thought to you when this all started, that this was going to severely impact how we were able to manage and oversee our clinical sites for the trials that we manage here at Alira Health. So what we had to do is, I'll go to this next slide here, we had to kind of run through 4 major steps as to how we were going to tackle this situation. So the first step was information collection from sites. So we needed to communicate with all of our sites, and several of them proactively communicated with us to provide COVID-19 related plans or policies that they had put in place. And that was really helpful. And for those that didn't provide those plans right away, we reached out to participating sites and gathered information about how this was affecting them, if they were going to be able to continue enrolling to studies, if they were going to be able to accommodate remote monitoring during this time where we couldn't get on site, and to what extent. So would they be able to provide remote access to an EMR system or redacted source documents so that we could review and source data verify the same information we would on site, typically from a remote location. So that was the first step, was a mass effort to just collect a lot of information from the sites. And then the second step was to compile and review that information along with our sponsors and clients and evaluate what we needed to do going forward for these sites. Were there certain ones that needed to close enrollment temporarily? Were there certain sites where we weren't going to be able to maintain proper oversight, which is required per the FDA guidelines. So we went through that evaluation with our studies as well. And then the next step was to prepare and implement a remote monitoring plan. So for studies that were traditionally 100% SDV studies with all in-person visits, there was a monitoring plan in place, but we needed to adapt that to determine how we were going to monitor remotely. And then that required also training on that new remote plan for our CRAs on how they were going to transition to this new model of monitoring. And then the fourth step, and one that's still ongoing with all of the sites that we manage, is to really keep the communication lines open. So that's always critical to keep the communication lines open between all parties. But during this time especially, we want to make sure that we're staying informed about any new site policies since things are changing so quickly. And also that, they're aware that we're here to support them, but kind of trying to strike that balance between staying informed and being supportive, but not overwhelming these sites that have so much to deal with right now. So it was definitely an intensive process doing this rapid switch over to remote monitoring.
I'm sorry. Thanks for waiting. I was on mute. Amy, as Chelsea mentioned, I was very concerned following the this information gathering phase and still didn't have a lot of confidence. But as it turned out, we began remote monitoring and it looked pretty good. What was your sense and how do you feel about the remote monitoring efforts undertaken by us?
Sure, Harry. I would say the transition has been very successful. Sites have been cooperative. The transition has gone quickly. We found out about, what was going on with COVID-19, and we started hearing from sites in early March that they weren't going to allow our monitors on site. And we shifted really quickly. We found out in early March, like I said, and we had some sites that were already allowing us or were capable of accommodating our remote monitoring visits in the middle of March. One of the things that was helpful in preparing for this was that we were able to sort of bucket the sites. We had some sites, as Chelsea mentioned, that already had EMR systems set up to accommodate remote monitoring, or basically remote EMR access for our monitors. So the transition at those sites was relatively smooth. Some of those sites even work with electronic investigational site files. So we even had access to their regulatory documents remotely. Then we had other sites who either use EMR or don't use EMR, but were willing to provide us with redacted source. Then there were a bucket of sites where we needed to start to think and work with them and be a little bit creative and be flexible. And then lastly, we had a small group of sites that needed a little bit more time to identify how they were going to transition to remote monitoring. They were going to need to work with their IT departments and other sort of overhead or people above them in identifying the best ways to allow us to continue our oversight. One thing that was really interesting is we did have a number of sites that reached out to us who used EMR and asked us if they could have a monitor join them on a meeting just like this, where basically they were going to give over-the-shoulder access to the EMR system. And we were actually, at first, we were kind of thought maybe that would be a little clumsy, but it actually turned out to work out really well because this person at the site is used to that EMR system and was able to navigate it relatively quickly. And the monitor could just tell them what they wanted to see, what they wanted to source verify, and the person at the site could bring it right up on the screen for them.
Thanks, Amy. Chelsea, so while it appeared that remote monitoring was actually potentially useful and effective, you shared and had some really serious concerns and continue to have some concerns and some challenges associated with this process. What have you seen?
Sure, thanks, Harry. So it's definitely been a process across our sites, and Amy mentioned some of the successes we've had, but we still have encountered a lot of challenges, especially with trying to make this transition so quickly. So there are several sites that just weren't set up at all for remote monitoring. So they were definitely slower to make the transition. They needed to work with groups within their institution, with their IT groups to set up remote monitoring policies and plans, work with their IT group to maybe implement new systems to be able to provide source remotely. And then even at those sites that did already have EMR access set up and available remotely, we ran into IT issues. There were, a few of our monitors who had remote visits set up. They were supposed to have access to remote EMR, but ended up having to spend, a day working with the site's IT department to really get, the access set up and to view what they needed to view. So we've run into that. And then, as Amy said, there are a bucket of sites, and it is larger than maybe we would have thought that weren't able to provide either remote EMR access or redacted source documents. So at this point, we would be going blind to the source at those sites and not able to verify anything between when this started and now. So at those specific sites, there is going to be a backlog of data that needs to be verified on site when we are able to get back on site. And for now, they're kind of just in a temporary suspension. So I think the fact of the matter is it's been an interesting transition, but there are just still so many sites that aren't really set up to accommodate remote monitoring.
Okay, so Amy, this isn't the first time we've heard about remote monitoring. I know historically remote monitoring has been talked about and debated, and it was going to be here to stay, but it really never has materialized until now. Can you give us a brief history of remote monitoring, where it came from, and why it had promise at the time? She's muted.
I was muted. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes. So when it comes to remote monitoring, I feel like it really became an idea, a hot topic, something that companies were interested in doing when a lot of sites started to transition to using electronic data capture systems, so EDC. Because now with an EDC system, site staff, people that weren't at the site, let me correct that, study team members, so people at the sponsor, people at the CRO, would have access to the data in real time as sites were entering it. So that really kind of created this interest in, what can we do remotely? What are some things that we no longer have to go to the site to do? And in my opinion, that kind of started around 2004. That's when sponsors and CROs really started to use EDC systems instead of running sites with paper case report forms that actually had to be looked at on site. But if you go back, so one thing that's interesting about monitoring is if you go back to 1996 and you look at the ICH GCP guidance, it does not specify anywhere there that on-site monitoring is the only way to monitor. Our regulations have actually never prescribed a specific monitoring technique, but rather that each protocol have a study-specific monitoring plan appropriate for that study. With EDC coming into play around 2004 and the early 2000s, there was definitely a lot of excitement around the possibility of having real-time access to data and monitors needing to be on site less. But the transition to monitoring with less visits to sites didn't become the norm as maybe some of us had expected. And then in the late 2000s, we saw an increase in clinical trial quantity and complexity that again seemed to amplify the need for more efficient and quality monitoring. And therefore, the idea of remote monitoring resurfaced. It became a hot topic once again. And then in 2011, We did get more guidance from the FDA, which I think helped a lot of sponsors and CROs feel like, okay, now we've got the FDA on board with this. In August 2011, the FDA released a revised monitoring guidance document. And then in 2013, they actually issued risk-based monitoring guidance. Okay? And they did this in an effort to encourage sponsors to consider a change in their approach to monitoring. The change being decreasing time on site and employing other methods for monitoring. However, I would say even with this guidance, our industry has continued to remain focused on on-site monitoring with 100% SDV and has not really made an overall switch to remote monitoring.
Amy, you're a big proponent of remote monitoring, and there's some real benefits that you've discussed with me from time to time. Tell us about some of the real wins for sponsors and for CROs when it comes to remote monitoring.
Yeah, I've definitely been on board with remote monitoring since I became aware of it and knew that it was an opportunity and something that we could do with the studies that we're running. First and foremost, it's less expensive. You think about the time, not just the time, but the cost of having monitors on site. And getting a monitor on site often includes airfare, hotel room stays, cabs to and from the airport. Now we have Uber, meals, all of that stuff. It can be quite expensive when you have a monitoring plan that consistently has monitors going on sites at regular intervals for multiple days at a time. The other thing that's nice with remote monitoring is that you can actually increase the visit volume. So because you're removing that time spent traveling, your CRAs are actually able to conduct more remote visits than they would in-person visits in the same amount of time. Okay, this model allows for more frequent source data verification. Another benefit is the CROs can review the data, CROs or sponsors can review the data remotely and watch for data trends, including delays in data entry or query resolution, and can then reach out to sites immediately for correction. So it allows us to function more proactively than reactively.
Chelsea, these are some very meaningful and important benefits, but I still think you're not completely sold, and I think you've identified, along with many others, some real impediments to remote monitoring. Could you discuss some of those?
Sure. I think I'll kind of go through each of those points with a bit of a counter argument. So there definitely are cases where remote monitoring will be less expensive for sponsors, for CROs. However, there are circumstances where it actually might be more expensive. So sponsors will save on travel costs for in-person visits. However, we may need to go to some of those sites anyway, especially if we find concerning data trends during that remote review. So in that case, we would then be paying for both a remote visit and an in-person visit. And also, since remote monitoring isn't really universally used right now, it's often not built into site budgets at the start of a trial. So I think if it starts becoming more prevalent and more of the norm, that sites will start building costs for prep time for those remote visits into their budgets, which will also increase the cost for the sponsor. And the reason they would do that is because for some sites, not for all sites, but for some sites, it is an increased workload for them. And especially with that increased visit volume that could come with remote visits and being able to do more remote visits than in-person visits within the same amount of time, that's going to be more visits that the site has to prepare for. And if we're doing those remotely, for certain sites that can provide remote EMR access, it will probably be the least work for them. But for the sites that need to provide redacted source documents, especially if they have to manually, print out documents, black out personal information, rescan it back in, send it to us. For studies that are complex and are collecting a lot of data, that is very time intensive. So I think it could be more work for the sites, and that would also result in an increased cost. And then there's definitely identification of trends early within the data and any issues we're seeing. But I am still a little concerned that we could still miss data trends, especially if we're not on site being able to comb through the full medical record, if we're only getting redacted source from sites, something could accidentally be missed, and a medical history or an adverse event that should have been reported and captured in the EDC system wouldn't be caught if we're not able to really comb through the full medical records. And then the last thing I'll say is it can definitely be seen as a more proactive approach. However, there are certain things that we can't do remotely that we need to do to maintain oversight, such as drug accountability for certain studies, and just visiting those sites to ensure that they are suitable for the study, that everything is feasible, we have enough equipment, and we do tend to like to do those visits in person, and just in general, maintaining and building that in-person connection with the sites, with the PI, with the study coordinators, and the whole study team. I think having that strong bond definitely is important. I don't know that everyone realizes how important it is in increasing the productivity and efficiency of the study. And I think if we lose that, we might not really see how important it was until it's not there anymore.
Amy, some pretty good points made by Chelsea in response. What do you say in retort? What do you think you would say in response to some of those challenges?
Harry, I do have to agree. Those are all really good points raised by Chelsea. But I still feel or believe that much of the work traditionally done in person can efficiently be done remotely. I recently had an experience monitor, so someone who's been in the industry for a long time, mentioned to me, why are sponsors and CROs still paying for monitors to spend so much time on site and spend, which costs money, and then also paying for airfare, hotel, and meals to review data and to conduct SDV, when that source that they need can actually really be sent to the monitor and be reviewed from their home office. I think for every protocol or trial, our best approach is to start with identifying what can we do offsite and how, and then figuring out what's left that we have to do on site. I think when you sit down and think about it, you may be surprised at how much can really be done off site, and that a trial can be successful with a minimum but appropriate number of on-site visits.
Thank you, ladies. Very, very interesting and great points on both sides of the argument. But we've been dealing with a COVID-19 situation where this has been imposed upon us more than the industry itself has sort of transitioned to what it thinks is a best practice. So let's try to be prognosticators. Amy, I'll start with you. Do you think remote monitoring is here to stay when COVID-19 becomes a non-issue, when we have the option of doing whatever it is we want to do? What's your sense?
So, Harry, I do agree with you in that, never before has there been an industry-wide need to transition to remote monitoring with COVID-19. And perhaps now that everyone has been forced to try it and to implement new processes, it may have more sticking power. We have been successful in the work that we've been doing in transitioning sites to remote monitoring. And we have found that the teams we work with have embraced the processes and that it seems to be working well and that we're seeing some cost effectiveness.
Chelsea, I'm guessing you may not share Amy's opinion on this. What's your sense, and what do you think about the future of remote monitoring without the onus of COVID as a motivator?
Sure. So I think that definitely the required push to do it right now is something that has never happened before, and could lead to it sticking more. But I strongly believe that remote monitoring is not going to become the norm and replace in-person monitoring unless it is fully embraced by the sites. So I think the sites are really the drivers of this change, because if they, it's all going to depend on if they embrace it and want to move forward with it and invest in the necessary, technology to be able to do it efficiently. So I think that the efficiency and the practicality of continuing with remote monitoring is going to really be driven by the sites. I think right now there are still too many sites that haven't really been able to fully get on board with remote monitoring. There are many possibilities for that. EMR systems can be costly. Some sites won't have the manpower to have to manually redact source documents and send them, especially for a complex study. And I think just in general that a lot of sites right now have accommodated it and tried to make new policies, compromise, make exceptions, because they have to. And I think we've definitely gotten the feeling from some of our sites that it's really seen as a temporary measure for them, and that they see an end to it and are looking forward to the end to it. And once they don't need to do it anymore, I think that many of them will gladly revert back to in-person monitoring.
So Amy, as much as you make the case for remote monitoring going forward, we have this challenge, which is we can perhaps inform our sponsors, and CROs can evolve and take on the challenges, but we don't always control our sites. And it sounds like we've got a real burden with regard to certain sites that just may not transition and may not be receptive to this for cost reasons, HIPAA reasons, legal reasons, and the like. So how do you recommend we move forward in terms of implementing remote monitoring if we've got some of these impediments?
Yeah, Harry, I think there are things that we can do in the way that we write our monitoring plans to keep everyone happy. In my experience, I really feel like a hybrid approach to monitoring is the best approach. In this model, it includes a mix of in-person visits. I think we all agree that we do still need to go to our sites and to see how our sites operate. So this model would still include on-site visits, but would also include remote visits, central monitoring, and then be designed with risk-based monitoring. So the monitoring plan will be written to include all of these items and then be tailored to the study. I think an easy place for people to start when considering a monitoring plan or considering adding remote monitoring and risk-based monitoring is to note the number of traditional in-person monitoring visits that could be transitioned to remote visits if the infrastructure is in place at your sites. Central monitoring is done kind of standard. I think it's gone on and didn't really have maybe a term applied to it, but that's the monitoring that's occurring by your in-house team. Okay, anything your data managers are doing, your biostatisticians, your medical monitors, the safety team, they're always looking at data from their perspective, and that's central monitoring. I can then encourage incorporation of risk-based monitoring into the monitoring plan. So what that involves is identifying the most meaningful data for the trial. You can use your findings from remote monitoring and central monitoring to identify and mitigate missing data, protocol deviations, and other things that could put the integrity of the critical data at risk. And then use that information to identify sites that require or need an on-site visit. And then those on-site visits become tailored to the needs of the site. They're not necessarily for source data verification. They're for being on site to work with the site team, to provide retraining, work one-on-one in the ED system. Maybe they're struggling to answer queries, or they're struggling to enter data, and they just need some guidance.
Thanks, Amy. Chelsea, Amy's proposed this hybrid model. What do you think of the hybrid approach?
Thanks. I like it. So I think it's a really good model that addresses a lot of the concerns that I have with fully going to a remote monitoring model. So I think this hybrid plan that's outlined here on this slide, allows us to maintain a lot of the benefits of in-person visits. We can maintain in-person qualification or initiation visits where we need to. And we're still able to do in-person visits to conduct monitoring for sites that haven't built the infrastructure yet to be able to do remote SDV. And maybe as those sites come on board, we may be able to increase the number of remote visits and decrease the number of in-person visits. I think, and even for sites that can accommodate remote monitoring right now, I agree that it's a good idea to kind of alternate or determine a frequency where we do some visits remotely, some in person, and then we can still be on site periodically to really maintain that relationship with the study team in person, to be able to thoroughly comb through any medical records if we feel that we're missing anything, conduct drug accountability, and then I think, as Amy mentioned, really conduct any training or retraining in person that we think might be warranted based on what we've discovered in our remote, central, and risk-based monitoring. So I think there's some extensive training that can also be done remotely, but I think having that in-person training we've seen in the past is often a little more effective, being able to sit down with a data entry coordinator and maybe go through some of the challenges that they've been having. So I think it's a great approach. I think that I'd like to see it become more pervasive in the industry, and I hope that that's the direction that we're heading.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks, Amy. Let me just conclude by saying that I think today's short webinar and to this point has identified and opened the door to a potential future that includes remote monitoring. And I think that there's a lot of things to be upset about in terms of the damage that COVID has caused to our economy, that COVID has caused to ourselves. But there are some silver linings, and one of them is that we've suddenly forced the sites to recognize, and sponsors, that there's an alternative here that can save us money and perhaps help us do our job better. Do we really know how it's going to play out yet? No. Are there challenges at certain sites? Yes. But I do think that remote monitoring has a future, and I think that as an industry, the burden is on us to lower costs and run trials better, and I think that we now have an opportunity to take this remote monitoring experience and put it into the mainstream. So thank you, guys. This was really interesting, and I've enjoyed it. At this point, I'm going to transition us to a Q&A session for about 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps, depending upon how many questions we have. And I've got the questions here in front of me, and I'm gonna start with the first question, which I think I'll pose to both of you, starting with Amy. Amy, do you think the guidelines for remote monitoring will change as a result of what we've learned from this particular experience with remote monitoring during COVID?
I don't think they're necessarily going to change, because I think they're adequate as is. I think they may continue to undergo revisions, but I don't really think they're going to change. Because
okay, I think Chelsea, anything to add? Sorry, Amy, I didn't mean to talk over you. Anything else you wanted to say?
I'm good.
Okay.
Not for me, Harry. I think she's right. I think, we continuously see revisions coming out in, guidelines, and maybe they'll become a little more specific, offer a little more structure for how to embrace remote monitoring. But I don't see any significant shifts from the guidance that we have.
Okay. Another question, which I'll direct to either of you, but I'll actually take the first crack at it. The question is, one of our listeners has heard from CRAs outside the United States that the EU has not been as receptive as US sites at allowing EMR access. The question is, have we had experience with sites in the EU allowing EMR access for CRAs? I'd like to just take the first leap at addressing this. I think that the questioner is correct that the EU has not been nearly as receptive to remote monitoring and EMR access as US sites have been. The privacy restrictions in Europe are onerous. The IT limitations are different. And I think that many sites have struggled to figure out solutions with their legal departments and otherwise to try to address some of these COVID-related concerns. Not to mention that COVID hit Europe pretty hard in some areas, making it even more difficult to arrange communications to allow for remote monitoring visits. But Amy and Chelsea, anything that you've seen from your experiences that might be helpful in addressing this question?
All I was going to say, Harry, is if we can move beyond Europe and just the rest of the world, outside of US and Canada, and just keep in mind we all have similar regulations, but different regulations. And like you mentioned in the EU, they have, stricter regulations on confidentiality and other things. So I have a feeling that not just in the EU, but in some of the other major areas in the rest of the world where they're doing clinical research, they're having similar struggles to the EU, and that perhaps it's not going quite as smoothly as it has for the US trials.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, I think, Harry, I think it's definitely more difficult in the EU, but I don't think that necessarily means that remote monitoring doesn't have a future in the EU. I think it might be a bit more challenging to launch, but I think there are many people out there who might find creative solutions to being able to maintain confidentiality and security and still find a way to use some remote monitoring.
Chelsea, I think that's a great point. I think it is incumbent upon us to come up with creative ideas and challenge the notions that you can't do this, but also balancing the understanding that sites can occasionally be rigid and legal departments can be rigid, and you have to live in that world as well. Here's an interesting question that I think dovetails nicely with that dilemma. One of our listeners has asked, and I think, Amy, this is a good question for you to take. He was curious about cybersecurity issues regarding the sharing of patient-protected data via screen share for remote monitoring. So in terms of some of this, quote, over-the-shoulder review, how do you address those kinds of concerns, and how would we address them in general?
Mm-hmm. So I think the interesting thing is we basically, in a remote environment, in an on-site environment, we really technically have the same level of risk. Patient confidentiality is something that we need to maintain at all times, whether we're on-site or remote. Most of our sites, or I would say all of our sites that are giving us some sort of EMR access, especially if it's us navigating remotely, that system has been set up with the appropriate safeguards in place. They're secure systems that maintain patient confidentiality. So even when we're on site, we're limited in the EMR. You may not be familiar with that if you're not a monitor, but when we go to a site, if we do have EMR access at the site, it's limited to just the patients who are enrolled in our study. So if it's a site that just has one patient in our study, that's the only patient we have access to within the EMR. So it would be the same from a remote standpoint.
Okay, thanks, Amy. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Chelsea, one of our listeners asked, are there some types of studies that lend themselves to remote monitoring better than others?
Definitely.
Sure, I can take that one. I think yes. My answer would be yes. The complexity of the study, the amount of data that is required to be collected for the study is definitely going to affect the efficiency of remote monitoring. I think even for complex studies, it can still be effective if this whole remote EMR access model is really embraced by sites. I think that for studies that are not collecting that much data, then yes, I think it's a very realistic model to use, almost solely remote based. For more complex studies, we may want to be on site a little more, be able to provide that training, especially if there's some nuances in the study. But in general, yes, I think there are going to be certain studies that will lend themselves to remote monitoring more, but I think it can still be used at least partially in all studies.
Thanks, Chelsea. I think we have a great final question, because this last question brings us back to what we all think about when we run clinical trials, which is the human connection. Our last question is, how important do you feel the human connection is with monitoring? Do you feel that by not visiting in person, we lose the ability to really connect to our sites, resulting in sort of an out of sight, out of mind disconnect between the site, the study, the CRO, and the sponsor? Amy, you want to take the first crack at that?
Yeah, for sure. I'm sitting here nodding my head as you're reading that question, Harry, because yes, it's really important. The connection between the monitor and anybody else working with the site is really important. And, every site is different. Some sites kind of operate because they're really busy. They do data entry right before they know the monitor is coming. So if you're not coming a lot, they may fall behind in their data entry. So it's important to understand how your sites work. And I think you can still make important connections even when you're not on site. And I think the second best way to make those good connections is to actually get on the phone. I think limiting contact to email is where you're going to really probably get into problems and not have as good a relationship. So if we're decreasing our on-site time, I think we need to increase our communication, but we need to increase it through the phone so that we're still speaking one-on-one with either the study coordinator or a data manager or the study nurse.
That's a great point, Amy. Thank you. Chelsea, anything you'd like to add?
Not really. I 100% agree. I think my answer to that question is absolutely the in-person connection is critical. I don't think that we should really ever completely eliminate it. I think Amy's absolutely correct that the second best thing, if we are moving to a more remote approach, is to have phone conversations with the study team. It's definitely often difficult to convey exactly what you're trying to convey via email. Tone is difficult to interpret or to get right when you're trying to just communicate via email. So phone calls with sites are great. I think periodic in-person visits are still always going to be necessary. I think in general, as we move more virtual, I don't want to see that in-person human connection ever completely lost. I think it is important.
That's absolutely right, Amy. I mean, Chelsea, I think that we all agree, and one of the pleasures of working in the CRO is the human connection. And despite the fact that we don't actually see patients directly, we do interact on that basis, and it's a big part of what we do. So I would agree wholeheartedly. Well, I think we've accomplished our objective today, I hope, which is to hopefully entertain and inform you about this topic. I'd like to thank both of our presenters for a really interesting, I think, earnest and delightful conversation today. I've enjoyed it, and I'd like to thank our listeners as well for thoughtful questions. And I hope to see you all again soon in another one of these webinars. So Amy and Chelsea, thanks a lot. And we hope to see everyone again soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.